The story of Romeo and Juliet depends on people making a series of mistakes. In the opening scene, Benvolio tries to stop a fight and ends up making it worse. Then Daddy Capulet tries to tell his illiterate servant to invite guests to a party, but that only ends up making the uninvited Romeo invited. When Romeo tries to save Mercutio, Mercutio is stabbed beneath his arm. Juliet thinks that submitting to her father will give her the space to execute the friar's plan, but this only inspires him to move the wedding a day forward. And in Act 5, Romeo tries to reunite with Juliet in death, but in doing so, he will actually end up inspiring her death. Lots of good intentions that ultimately prove to be mistakes, and I certainly did not come close to mentioning them all. But it's not just a bunch of mistakes. This story also depends on a bunch of bad luck, particularly in Act 5. Romeo's man Balthasar learns about Juliet's death and brings word to Romeo with absolutely terrible timing. The friar charged with sending the letter to Romeo is unfortunately stuck in quarantine because of the plague. Paris decides to visit Juliet's tomb at, unfortunately, the exact moment that Romeo arrives. Romeo, unfortunately, ends his own life just moments before Juliet awakes. With all of this bad luck, it's no wonder the play warns us in the prologue that these are star-crossed lovers. They seem fated to end in tragedy. But also, because of all these mistakes, poor timing, and bad luck, this tragedy doesn't feel inevitable at all. In fact, it feels tragic because there were so many moments when it could have been prevented. It didn't need to go down like this. It often feels more like a series of bad choices too quickly made rather than an inevitable product of fate. And so we will explore this idea today as we go through the events of Act 5. And if this sort of exploration of Shakespeare sounds like it's your kind of thing, please consider subscribing and checking out my other videos about Romeo and Juliet. And with that out of the way, let's go through Act 5 play by play. Act 5 begins with Balthasar informing Romeo that Juliet has died, and Romeo does not take this information like a chill guy. He's moving before he's thinking and asking for ink and paper to draft a letter to his parents, then orders a horse so that he can start his journey back to Verona immediately. He even claims that with these actions, he's denying his stars or taking action against fate. But Balthasar asks him to slow down. "Sir, have patience. Your looks are pale and wild and do import some misadventure. By making decisions so quickly, he's bound to make a mistake." And this, of course, reflects him in the entire play. He and Juliet decide to get married the same night that they meet. He too quickly decides to fight Tybalt after Mercutio's death. Emotions guide Romeo's actions, and Romeo's actions are consequently impetuous. He moves before he thinks. There is barely any time at all between him thinking about poison and him buying poison as he exploits the poverty of an old apothecary who needs money more than he needs to uphold the law. I should make a video about the role of class in this story someday. Romeo's claim that gold is a kind of poison with his mo money, mo problems attitude highlights how the serving men and support staff have played an interesting role throughout this play. If anybody writes that essay, please let me know. Anyway, on to scene 2, which has Friar Lawrence finding out that his letter got stuck in quarantine and never made it to Romeo. The friar attributes this to bad luck, saying, "Oh, unhappy fortune." Now Juliet is going to wake up alone among a bunch of dead bodies, and it's kind of his fault. The friar tried to control the events of this situation and bring peace to Verona by supporting the hasty marriage of these two young people, but now the speed of this action has become too fast-paced for him to keep up. He tried to control the story, to execute personal choice, free will, but the success of those choices was contingent on pre-existing social conditions and the threat of plague, and neither accommodated his will. Watching the plot fall out of his control, he leaves scene 2 speeding towards Juliet's tomb, and that takes us to the final scene of the play, which takes place at the tomb. But it's not Friar Lawrence approaching, and it's not even Romeo approaching, it's Paris, who vows to visit her tomb nightly in a ritual of mourning. But that ritual is very quickly interrupted by Romeo, who has also arrived to perform a sort of ritual. The two seem very similar here. They both arrive at night, away from the public gaze of Verona. They both have a servant that they dismiss so that they can perform their ritual alone. They both aspire to a life with Juliet. So these similarities asks us to compare the two, and that comparison might reveal that they represent this tension between fate and free will. They both loved Juliet. Paris was the approved match, the fated match, the one the Capulets wanted for her, and the one that would have happened if Juliet took no action. Romeo was the chosen match, the one Juliet wanted for herself. Paris represents the status quo, fate, and Romeo the rebellion, free will. A marriage to Paris treats Juliet as an object of exchange. Capulet gives Juliet to Paris. A marriage to Romeo treats Juliet as a self-governing individual. She gave herself to Romeo. And when these two equal but different husbands fight, Romeo defeats Paris without even knowing who it is. When he understands eventually that he has killed Paris, Mercutio's kinsman, he curses his own fate. He says that one writ with me in sour misfortune's book. He blames his fate rather than his impulses. He once again allowed his emotions to take action before his senses could comprehend what was going on, and he blames the world rather than himself. It was a misfortune rather than a bad decision. And his rebellion against the world, against fate, continues when he sees Juliet's body and declares that he will set up his everlasting rest and shake the yoke of inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh. He will shake off the yoke of inauspicious stars. He'll rebel against fate with his hasty decision to poison himself. Fate and the world don't want him to end up with Juliet, but he's going to anyway. It seems like every attempt that he makes to shake off fate brings him one step closer to tragedy. I also find it interesting that he notes that he will now take up his everlasting rest in the Capulet tomb. It was the tradition that wives would take their everlasting rest in the tombs of their husband's family, but Romeo will rest in his wife's tomb with her family. He knowingly breaks with this tradition just as he broke with the ancient grudge between the two families. The momentum of tradition pushes him in one direction, and he always pushes back, and often with tragic consequences. And as Romeo dies in the Capulet tomb, Friar Lawrence appears. Another bit of bad timing. Just a couple minutes earlier, and the tragedy could have been avoided. The friar recognizes this. What an unkind hour is guilty of this lamentable chance. It's just bad luck. But of course, it's bad luck precipitated by his plan, a bad decision. He set these events into motion and then couldn't keep up with them. That said, he did make it in time to save Juliet. Friar Lawrence is there when she wakes up, but he hears the noise of the night watch, and he knows that much of the carnage in this tomb is the result of his plan, so he wants to quickly leave. He tells Juliet to get up and that he'll find a way for her to live in a nunnery, and then he just leaves. And we all know what happens next. Juliet does not follow him. She first tries to find some clean way to join Romeo, but feeling the pressure of the outside world, quickly grabs his dagger and does the deed. In Act 5, she speaks exactly 13 lines, one for each year of her life, and her final word is die. She'll never make it to 14. She's going to forever be an incomplete sonnet. I think it's notable that even though this whole thing is the story of their relationship, they both end up dying alone. They each make this final decision independently. They were both isolated from their communities for reasons disconnected from their desire for each other. Romeo was in exile for killing Tybalt, and Juliet just tried to escape a marriage that she didn't want. They somehow found each other within that isolation, but still, they will each ultimately die alone. Not really sure what my point is there, it just makes me sad. Eventually, the watch arrives and calls for the families. They also find Balthasar, the friar, and Paris's page. When the prince shows up, the friar retells what has happened in detail, and that speech goes on for so long that we have time to think about just how many times the story has been told. I mean, think about it. The play opens with a prologue that tells us the story before the play even begins. Then we all watch a fight in the first scene, only to have Benvolio repeat the action of that fight. Then, in Act 3, we have another fight, and then Benvolio again retells the story of Mercutio and Tybalt's death immediately after it happens. Now, we have just watched the entire play Romeo and Juliet. We've seen them finish their story, only to have Friar Lawrence repeat the entire action of the play one more time. At every stage of this play, the audience is told and retold what has happened and what will happen. The characters seem to feel as though they need to control or understand the story through retelling it over and over again. And of course, Romeo and Juliet is a retelling of an English poem that adapted a French translation of an Italian story, which was a retelling of an earlier Italian novella, which itself seemed to be based on the Greek myth of Pyramus and Thisbe. And this particular version of the story ends with Daddy Capulet and Daddy Montague promising to build a memorial for the couple. The impetuous couple who burned too bright and moved too quickly through life will be completely still and formed in solid gold. The prince promises that there will be more talk of these sad things in the days ahead, and of course, that is prophetic. The story will be told and retold over and over again. Romeo and Juliet will continue to be read and performed all over the world, inspiring more talk of these sad things over and over and over again. We have to keep going back over the details, keep recounting what just happened, keep wondering if there was a way to avoid this. This is not exclusively a tragedy of individuals with some personality flaw, nor is this an inevitable tragedy of fate. Personal choice and external circumstance combined to form this tragedy. It's not just bad decisions and it's not just bad luck, it's both. It's a tragic combination of choice and chance, but it is also a tragic combination of personal desire in conflict with pre-existing social institutions, or a tragic interaction between youthful impulses and slow-moving old men. Then again, this tragedy may be the result of a community that failed to accommodate the desires and subjectivities of two young individuals. No matter how we fashion it, we have to tell it and retell it over and over again because we have to figure out what happened so we can prevent it next time. And that's where I'll end this one. I'll have a couple more videos on feminist readings of Romeo and Juliet published soon. Please subscribe to be notified when they are published, and thank you for watching.